There is a story about the NBA that almost nobody tells in full, because telling it in full requires sitting with something uncomfortable. It requires looking at what the league actually was in 1984, not what we remember it being, and understanding what it meant that a 21-year-old kid from Wilmington, North Carolina, walked into that world and refused to leave until he had changed everything about it. The comfortable version of the story starts with the highlights, the dunks, the 6 championships, the shoes, the logo. But the full version starts somewhere darker, in a league that was described by its own corporate partners as too black to be marketable, too black to put on primetime television, too black for America to love the way it needed to be loved to survive. That's where Michael Jordan entered. And what he did, how he navigated it, what it cost him, and what it ultimately produced, is one of the most complex and consequential stories in the history of American sports. But before we get there, you need to understand what 1984 actually looked like. Because if you don't understand what Jordan walked into, you can't understand what he walked out with. In 1979, a Sports Illustrated article titled "Drug Use Runs Rampant in the NBA" set off a national conversation about professional basketball that would take years to quiet. Reports circulated that between 40 and 75% of all NBA players were using cocaine. The league was furious, the players were furious. Nobody could agree on whether the numbers were real or inflated. But the damage was done. The narrative had escaped. And in America in 1979, with the war on drugs beginning to build steam under the Reagan administration that was about to take power, a story about a league full of black men using cocaine didn't stay abstract for long. It became a story about what kind of people these players were, about whether they deserved to be in arenas, on television screens, in the living rooms of American families. The NBA's attendance collapsed. Arenas that had been packed went half empty. By the 1983-84 season, CBS had scheduled exactly 3 games for nationwide broadcast. 3 in an entire regular season. The league's own television partner didn't think anyone would watch. Most franchises were losing money. Some were on the verge of folding entirely. Hall of Famer Jerry West said it plainly years later. This league was in trouble. When David Stern became NBA commissioner in 1984, he inherited an institution that corporate America, and as one Associated Press account would later put it, probably regular America too, thought was too black, too drug-addled, not mainstream enough to command a significant piece of the sports landscape. That phrase, too black, was not written in any official memo or spoken in any board meeting on record. It lived in the behavior of sponsors who turned away, in television contracts that didn't come, in the ticket buyers who stayed home. It was the air the league breathed, invisible and pervasive. Stern's instinct was to build a product that could survive in that environment, to find players who could represent the league in ways that made white sponsors and white audiences comfortable. He understood that he was running a business where, as one academic analysis would later note, the goal was effectively making black men safe for white consumers in the interest of profit. The Bird-Magic rivalry was already helping. The story of Larry Bird, the hick from French Lick, the great white hope of the Boston Celtics, competing against Irvin "Magic" Johnson of the Los Angeles Lakers, gave the league a narrative that white fans could grip onto. Bird was their guy. Magic was someone they could cheer for or against. The league had a face that white America recognized. And then, in Stern's very first draft as commissioner, on June 19, 1984, a young man from North Carolina fell to the 3rd pick, passed over by Houston, who had a very good reason to take Akeem Olajuwon, and by Portland, who had a much less defensible reason to take Sam Bowie over the best guard in the draft. The Chicago Bulls picked Michael Jordan not because they particularly wanted him. They had spent weeks trying to trade the pick for a center, trying to acquire Jack Sikma or Terry Cummings, and none of those deals materialized. But because when the 2 players they had preferred to build around were gone, Jordan was what remained. General manager Rod Thorne said afterward that they had gotten a good player, not great, not historic, not the thing the league needed to survive. Good. What those words reveal is not incompetence. It's something stranger and more instructive, a failure of imagination that had very specific roots. To understand those roots, you need to go back further, back to Wilmington, North Carolina, Back to 1968, back to a kindergarten classroom where a 5-year-old Michael Jordan was separated from white students as a matter of official policy. You need to sit with that image for a moment, because Michael Jordan is not a story that starts in 1984. It starts in a segregated classroom. It starts in the specific textured reality of growing up black in a city where the Ku Klux Klan was not a historical footnote, but an active presence. Jordan himself would say later that the Klan was dominant in that environment, not in the history books, not in someone else's story, in his streets, in the air he breathed, in the way certain people looked at him before he had done a single thing to deserve or disprove their assumptions. In 1977, when Jordan was 14 years old, a girl at Laney High School called him a racial slur directly to his face. He threw a soda at her and was suspended. That same year, the television miniseries Roots aired across America, and Jordan watched it, watched the centuries of suffering visited upon his ancestors, watched the weight of American history land on him in a way that a classroom never had. He said later that he had opened his eyes for the first time about his history and what those people had to deal with. He also said something that surprised people when it became public much later, that at that time he considered himself a racist. He was against all white people. Not because he was born that way, but because that was what the world around him had been building inside him. Humiliation by humiliation. His mother Dolores pulled him back from that edge. She told him that what happened in the past had happened, but now he had to figure out what to make of things going forward, that it would be easy to hate for the rest of your life, that some people do. But you have to deal with what's happening now. He carried that with him. And the very next year, in 1978, he tried out for the varsity basketball team at Laney High School and didn't make it. The coach, Pop Herring, was looking for height. There was another kid, a junior named Leroy Smith, who was taller. Jordan's name wasn't on the list. He went home, he went to his room, he cried for a long time, and then he went back to the gym. He worked every day until nobody else was left in the building. He grew 4 inches that year. He added to his game constantly, building skills nobody had asked him to build, because nobody was watching and nobody was expecting anything. By his junior year, he made the varsity team. By his senior year, he was one of the best players in North Carolina. In 1982, as a freshman at the University of North Carolina, he made the game-winning shot against Georgetown with 32 seconds left to give Carolina the NCAA championship. And 6 years after the girl called him a slur in that hallway, 2 years after the coach didn't put his name on the list, Michael Jordan sat in the audience at Madison Square Garden's Felt Forum on draft night, wearing a white suit, and watched 2 franchises look right past him. What happened next would change the NBA, the sneaker industry, and the relationship between American corporations and black athletes forever. But only if a shoe company that was nearly bankrupt made the most frightening bet in the history of sports marketing. And only if Jordan, who wanted nothing to do with them, could be convinced to show up to a meeting. In the summer of 1984, Nike was not a basketball company. It was a running shoe company that had just posted its first quarterly loss in history. Phil Knight had gone on sabbatical and come back to find 400 employees laid off, budgets gutted, no Christmas party. The stock was trading at around $7 a share. Converse owned the basketball market, 56% of it. They had Magic Johnson, they had Larry Bird, they had Julius Erving. They had outfitted the 1984 Olympics itself, and Jordan had won his gold medal wearing their shoes. There was nothing Nike could do about it. Basketball wasn't theirs. It belonged to everyone else. Sonny Vaccaro, Nike's basketball marketing executive, had a different idea about that. He had been watching Jordan since the 1982 NCAA championship, had watched something develop in that player that he had only seen a handful of times in his career, something in how the game came through Jordan, a quality that couldn't be measured in shooting percentages or defensive statistics, a quality you could only see with your own eyes in a gym at close range. Vaccaro had been in enough gyms, had watched enough players to know the difference between very good and once in a generation. He believed Jordan was once in a generation. He bet his job on it. His proposal to Nike's leadership was considered borderline irrational. Don't spread the basketball budget across several rookies, he said. Put everything on one player, every dollar. Build a shoe specifically around Jordan. Not a team shoe with his name attached, but a brand within a brand. A signature line with his name on it and his input built into the design. Market him the way tennis players and golfers were marketed, as an individual athlete, not as a team employee. Make Jordan the product, not the shoes. Nike's leadership hesitated. Rob Strasser, the marketing director, a large, loud, brilliantly strategic man, studied the proposal and asked the right question: could Jordan actually carry this? Vaccaro said yes. What he didn't say, because he didn't need to, was that the question itself revealed how much imagination was required to see what Jordan was going to become. The league had just passed on him twice. The scouting reports called him a good player, and Vaccaro was standing in a room asking people to bet the entire basketball division of a company with a $7 stock on a 21-year-old who hadn't played a single professional game. The problem was that Jordan didn't want to be there. He had worn Adidas his entire life. He wore them in training, in everyday life, by choice, because he loved them. Nike, to him, was a running shoe company, not his world. When his agent David Falk told him about the Nike meeting, Jordan said, "Get me with Adidas." Falk went to Adidas. Adidas was in the middle of a chaotic internal succession after the death of founder Adi Dassler. They couldn't organize themselves enough to put together a serious offer. Converse came in with $100,000 a year and a standard contract, the same deal they gave Magic Johnson and Larry Bird, the deal that said, "You are one of many." Jordan went back to Adidas and said, essentially, match the Nike offer. Adidas couldn't match it. They didn't even have the right shoe size ready for his visit. The company was in disarray. Falk had to call Jordan's parents to get the Nike meeting to happen. Dolores Jordan was not someone you managed or maneuvered. She was protective, precise, and completely unsentimental about corporate promises. She had spent years watching people underestimate her son, coaches who cut him, scouts who rated him third, and she had developed a clear eye for the difference between what people said and what they actually meant. When she told Michael to go to Oregon and listen, he listened. What happened at Nike's campus in Beaverton has been told and retold, with different people claiming credit in different versions. Jordan himself has said it was George Raveling, his assistant coach on the 1984 Olympic team, who first convinced him to give Nike a serious chance, that Raveling had been in his ear throughout the Olympics telling him, "You gotta go Nike." Nike VP Rob Strasser and designer Peter Moore believe it was their pitch that changed his mind. Vaccaro has his own account. Phil Knight disputes Vaccaro's centrality to the story. The truth, as with most historical events that changed everything, has been claimed by several people simultaneously and belongs entirely to none of them. What is not disputed is what Jordan saw in that room. Designer Peter Moore had created a shoe in red and black, bold, unlike anything on an NBA floor, deliberately designed to break from the sea of white sneakers that professional basketball had always worn. Moore and Strasser showed Jordan footage of himself set to music. They showed him not as a prospect, not as a third pick, not as a question mark in a scouting report. They showed him as something that was already undeniable, already historic, already outside the normal vocabulary of basketball talent. And then Strasser and Falk structured something that had never been offered to a basketball player before. Not a flat endorsement fee, but a partnership. Jordan's name on the shoe, his royalty on every sale. His share of the brand they were going to build around him. On October 26, 1984, Jordan signed a 5-year, $2.5 million deal with Nike, 3 times more than any basketball player had ever received from a shoe company, a number that, in retrospect, looks almost comically modest against what followed. Almost immediately, a problem arrived that nobody anticipated, and that a brilliant marketing mind turned into the best advertising campaign in sports history. Jordan wore a red and black Nike shoe in a preseason game against the New York Knicks in October 1984. The NBA's uniform policy required shoes to be at least 51% white. Jordan's shoes violated this rule. The league's executive vice president, Russ Granick, sent a formal letter to Nike confirming the violation. The shoes were effectively banned. Jordan could be fined $5,000 every game he wore them. Rob Strasser read that letter and said, "We'll pay the fines." Then he told Peter Moore to build a commercial around the ban. The commercial showed Jordan's shoes, or rather showed them blocked out, censored, forbidden, while a voiceover announced, "On October 15th, Nike created a revolutionary new basketball shoe." On October 18th, the NBA threw them out of the game. Fortunately, the NBA can't keep you from wearing them. The ban was a gift. The controversy was free advertising. Overnight, a pair of basketball shoes became a symbol of rebellion, of authority challenged, of a young black man from North Carolina refusing to play by rules designed before he arrived. Kids who had never watched a Bulls game wanted them. The shoe wasn't just footwear anymore. It was a statement. The Air Jordan 1 launched in April 1985 at $65 a pair. By May, Nike had sold $70 million worth of them. By year's end, the Jordan brand had generated $126 million in revenue. The original 3-year projection had been $3 million. But here is the thing about all of this. The draft, the shoe deal, the overnight revolution, that tends to get lost in the mythology. None of it would have mattered if Jordan hadn't been able to perform on the court at a level that made every number and every story feel earned rather than manufactured. And in his first NBA season, he performed at a level that left even the best players in the world reaching for words that could contain it. What happened on the court that first year? What Jordan did to the doubters who had written the scouting reports and traded away the pick and called him good was not a correction. It was a demolition. But the building hadn't even started collapsing yet. The real reckoning was still coming, and it was going to arrive in the most unexpected form possible. Michael Jordan's rookie season in 1984-85 produced numbers that the league hadn't seen in decades. He averaged 28 2/10 points per game. He led the Chicago Bulls in scoring, rebounds, assists, and steals, the only rookie in NBA history to lead his team in all 4 categories. He won Rookie of the Year. The Bulls' attendance reversed course almost immediately. Games that had been played in front of half-empty arenas started filling up again. Jordan was not a good player. He was something the scouting reports had lacked the framework to describe. Larry Bird, who had 3 championships and a lifetime of watching basketball, saw Jordan play early that season and said something that cut through every analytical framework the league had developed. He said this was the best player he had ever seen, not the best rookie, not a promising prospect, the best player. Period. You can feel how much that statement cost him. Bird was not a man given to easy superlatives, and handing that kind of tribute to a rookie in public was a statement of something more than admiration. It was a statement of recognition, a declaration that the categories everyone had been using were insufficient. And still, the doubt didn't vanish. It transformed. The goalposts moved, as they always do for anyone proving something the world doesn't want to be proven. The new version of the doubt was, he's selfish. He can't win the big one. Individual brilliance that doesn't translate to team success. A scorer, not a champion. The Bulls were winning more games, attendance was recovering, Nike was printing money, but the criticism persisted. Jordan shoots too much. Jordan doesn't make his teammates better. Jordan can't win when it matters. The racial subtext of these criticisms was rarely stated explicitly. It lived in the language around team player versus gunner, in the way Jordan's style of play was contrasted unfavorably with Bird's basketball intelligence, in the standards applied to Jordan's leadership that were never quite applied the same way to white franchise players. This is the moment to pause and consider something that Jordan himself has addressed, and that the people who love him and the people who criticize him have both used as a weapon. In 1990, during a racially charged United States Senate race in North Carolina, Jordan was asked to endorse Harvey Gantt, an African-American Democrat who was running against Jesse Helms, a man described by political commentator David Broder as the last prominent, unabashed white racist politician in America. Gantt had won the mayoral races in Charlotte. He was a serious candidate. He needed visible support from prominent black figures in North Carolina, and Jordan was the most prominent black figure in North Carolina by a significant margin. Jordan declined. He sent a private financial contribution, he later said, a sizable check, but he would not make a public endorsement. When a reporter asked why, Jordan reportedly said, either as a joke on a bus with Scottie Pippen and Horace Grant, or as a sincere statement of commercial philosophy, depending on which account you read. Republicans buy sneakers too. The quote became notorious. It followed him for the rest of his career. Barack Obama, interviewed for the ESPN documentary The Last Dance in 2020, said he had been disappointed by Jordan's silence. Knowing what Jesse Helms stood for, Obama said, "You would have wanted to see Jordan push harder on that." Helms beat Gant in both 1990 and 1996. Jordan's response when he addressed it directly in The Last Dance was layered. He said he had been joking. He said he had sent money. He said he had never thought of himself as an activist, that he thought of himself as a basketball player. He said, "Was that selfish? Probably. But that was my energy. That's where my energy was." And here is where the story becomes genuinely complicated, because both things are true at the same time, and reconciling them requires sitting with complexity rather than resolving it into a clean verdict. Jordan grew up in Wilmington with the KKK in his backyard. He watched Roots at 14 and said it made him a racist against all white people. He threw a soda at a girl who called him a slur. He absorbed decades of American racism in a segregated classroom, on baseball teams where he was one of 2 black kids, in the specific weight of being told your presence was a provocation. And he made a calculated, strategic, entirely conscious decision about how to respond to it. The decision was this: he would answer in performance. He would make the argument through excellence rather than speech. He would build something so large, so undeniable, so historically unprecedented that the question of whether someone like him belonged at the highest level would become permanently, irreversibly ridiculous. He would make the idea of a black athlete as the global face of American sport not a political statement, but a commercial fact, something corporations lined up to pay for, something that transcended racial lines in the marketplace before it transcended them anywhere else. Was this enough? For some people who lived through 1990 and watched Helms win again, it was not nearly enough. For others, it was the most radical thing he could have done, building black economic power at a scale that no protest or endorsement could have reached. Both positions have real substance. The tension between them is not resolved by Jordan's career, it's illuminated by it. What is not in dispute is what Jordan continued to do on the basketball court year after year, in a league that was rebuilding itself around his image, that was deliberately constructing, with stern strategic hand on the wheel, a version of basketball that was commercially palatable to white audiences, while remaining predominantly black on the court. Jordan was the center of that construction. He was the face. He was the proof that a black player could be the most marketable athlete on earth, that a black man could sell to everyone, that the league that had been called too black could become the league that everyone watched. The championships came in 1991, then 1992, then 1993, then the retirement, then the return, then 1996, 1997, 1998, 6 titles, 5 MVPs, 10 scoring titles, the most decorated career in the history of professional basketball. But there was one moment, early in the career, before the championships, before the commercials, before the worldwide dominance, one moment that crystallizes everything about what Jordan was building and everything it was built on. It happened in April 1986 in Boston Garden during the first round of the playoffs against the best team in basketball. And what happened that night is still, decades later, the single most extraordinary individual performance in NBA playoff history. Jordan had spent most of his second season, 1985-86, in a hospital boot. A navicular stress fracture in his left foot, diagnosed 3 games in, had kept him out for 64 regular season games. The Bulls' doctors told him to rest. The organization told him to rest. The medical advice was unambiguous. Come back next year, let the bone heal, protect the career that everyone could see was going to be historic. Jordan had listened to part of that advice, but there was a version of resting that wasn't available to him, the part where he accepted someone else's ceiling on what he was allowed to attempt. When the orthopedic specialist told him there was a 10% chance that returning too early could cause permanent damage, Jordan processed that number the way a man processes a number when the alternative is silence. 10% was the risk, 90% was the path forward. He came back. He returned with limited minutes, managed by a franchise that was trying to protect its investment. He chafed against the restriction, and the tension between player and front office that would define their relationship for years began hardening in those months. But when the Bulls scraped into the playoffs, it was a 30-52 season, Jordan was cleared to play at something approaching his actual level. The first-round opponent was the Boston Celtics. In 1986, the Celtics were not simply a good team. They were widely considered one of the greatest teams ever assembled in professional basketball. Larry Bird, Kevin McHale, Robert Parrish, Dennis Johnson, Danny Ainge, Bill Walton, a roster of future Hall of Famers, operating with the cold, methodical precision of a defending champion. They had finished the regular season 67-15, the best record in the league. They were the #1 seed. They expected to move past the Chicago Bulls in 3 games and face more serious competition in the next round. In Game 1 at Boston Garden, Jordan scored 49 points. The Celtics won. In Game 2, on April 20, 1986, Jordan scored 63 points. 63 points in a playoff game against 5 future Hall of Famers who took turns trying to stop him, after missing most of a season with a broken foot, on the road, in the loudest arena in basketball, wearing red and black Air Jordans. He made 22 of 41 field goal attempts, 19 of 21 free throws. Almost every shot he took came with a defender on him. The Celtics sent multiple players at him simultaneously, ran every trap their coaches could design, and Jordan came out of each trap with the ball in a position to score. The game went to double overtime. Boston won 135-131. The Celtics swept the series. In the math of wins and losses, nothing changed. But in the locker room in Boston after Game 2, something happened that had never happened before and hasn't quite happened since. Larry Bird, who had scored 36 points of his own and led the best team in basketball to a playoff victory in double overtime, sat down in front of reporters and said, "I think it's just God disguised as Michael Jordan." God disguised as Michael Jordan. Bird was not a man who performed for audiences. He was from French Lick, Indiana, and he spoke the way a man from French Lick, Indiana speaks, directly, without ornament, without the kind of theatrical flourish that media training produces. When Larry Bird looked at what Jordan had just done and reached for the only vocabulary that seemed adequate, he was telling you something very specific about what he had witnessed. He added, "I couldn't believe anybody could do that against the Boston Celtics." The Celtics moved on. Jordan went home, his team eliminated. The Bulls, having lost 4 games to 1 in a series everyone expected them to lose. By any conventional metric, nothing had been accomplished. And yet the 63 points traveled through the league and through the country like a rumor that turned out to be true. Players talked about it. Coaches talked about it. The franchise executives who had tried to trade the 3rd pick and called Jordan a good player on draft night heard about it and understood, perhaps for the first time with full clarity, what they almost hadn't had. It was a performance produced in defeat. It had no ring attached to it, no championship trophy, no celebration. It was just a number, 63, and a quote from Larry Bird and the image of a 23-year-old from North Carolina doing things to the best basketball team on earth that the best basketball team on earth had no answer for. The Jordan brand already existed. The league was already beginning to rebuild itself around his image. The commercial infrastructure was already in place. But this moment, this specific performance, in this specific building, against this specific opponent, was the first fully visible proof of what all of it had been built on. And there is a detail about that night that stays with you when you know it. Jordan wore his Air Jordans, the red and black shoes that the league had banned, the shoes that the NBA had tried to push off the court with a $5,000 fine. The shoes that a corporation had bet everything on, the shoes that represented, in their bold colors and their refusal to blend in, something about Jordan that went beyond basketball. He wore them in Boston Garden against the champions and scored 63 points. It was, in its way, the perfect image. The shoes the league had tried to ban, worn by the player the league had originally undervalued, producing the most extraordinary individual performance in playoff history. Against the backdrop of a sport that had been described as too black to succeed, by a man who had grown up in a city with an active clan, who had been cut from a high school team and passed over on draft night and told, in 100 different ways and from 100 different directions, that he was not quite what was needed. The championship rings were still coming. The dynasty was still being built. But the argument was already being won. The 6 championships came between 1991 and 1998. They came in 2 distinct phases, 3 in a row, then a retirement that shocked the world, then a return, then 3 more. They came against different opponents in different eras, requiring different versions of Jordan at different stages of his physical life. They came with an entire country watching, with television ratings that by the late 1990s had made the NBA Finals the most watched sporting event on Earth outside of the Olympics and the World Cup. David Stern's rebuilding project had succeeded beyond anything the corporate partners of 1984 could have imagined. The league that had been called too black to be mainstream had become the league that defined mainstream. And at the center of all of it, at the center of the television contracts and the global marketing and the shoe empire, generating hundreds of millions of dollars a year, was Michael Jordan. The face, the argument, the proof. By 2014, Jordan had become the first billionaire in the history of professional basketball, accumulating wealth not from NBA salaries. His total career earnings from playing were around $94 million, but from the Jordan brand, from Nike royalties, from investments and business ownership, including his stake in the Charlotte Hornets that eventually made him the first black majority owner of an NBA team. The brand he had built on a 5-year, $2.5 million deal in 1984 was generating by the 2020s somewhere between $5 and $7 billion in annual revenue for Nike, with Jordan receiving roughly 5% of that in royalties, more than $300 million a year from a deal he had never wanted to sign with a company he had never worn before October 1984. The numbers are almost impossible to sit with. They are not the point except insofar as they are the point, insofar as they represent what Jordan was actually building throughout his career and what it meant for the question that had always been underneath all of it. Because here is what actually happened when Michael Jordan became the face of the NBA in a country that had described that league as too black. The thing that corporate America had identified as a liability became, through Jordan's specific form of excellence, a different kind of asset. The blackness didn't disappear from the court. It couldn't. The players were still predominantly black. The culture of the game was still rooted in communities that white corporate America had long treated as marginal. What Jordan did was demonstrate, with his body and his game and his business, that the problem had never been blackness. The problem had been the world's willingness to let its assumptions about blackness limit what it was capable of seeing. That is a complicated kind of victory. It is not a clean one. The racial politics of the NBA did not end with Jordan. They shifted, evolved, took new forms. The dress codes, the controversies, the ongoing negotiations between black athletes and white ownership that continue to this day. Jordan's choice to stay silent on specific political fights, to focus on commercial power rather than explicit activism, remains contested among people who were looking for something different from the most visible black athlete in America. But Jordan himself, in his 2020 appearance in The Last Dance, addressed this with a clarity that is worth sitting with. He said he had always led by example, that if you put in the work, if you show up every day and perform at the highest level possible, that is itself a form of argument. That the best answer to the doubt, to the assumptions, to the structures that told you that you didn't belong at the top, was to be so completely, historically, undeniably at the top, that the question could never be asked again with a straight face. Whether you agree with that position or not, whether you think it was enough or not, the evidence of what it produced is available to examine. The boy from the segregated kindergarten in Wilmington became the most commercially powerful athlete in human history. The kid who was cut from the varsity team came back and made the coach's error into a famous story about the danger of underestimating someone. The third pick of the 1984 NBA draft made the franchises that passed on him into historical cautionary tales. The player a shoe company almost didn't sign generated more than $2 billion for that company and entirely rewrote the rules of athlete endorsement deals, creating a template that LeBron James and Steph Curry and every major athlete since has followed. And the league that corporate America called Too Black in 1984? It became the most globally popular basketball league in the history of the sport, with offices and broadcast deals and devoted fan bases on every inhabited continent, not despite being black, because of the specific, explosive, historically unprecedented way that black excellence showed up in it when the moment arrived. There is a moment from Jordan's 2009 Hall of Fame induction speech, a speech that the sports media criticized for being petty, for being self-congratulatory, for naming too many doubters and not being gracious enough about the victory. That clarifies something important. Jordan stood at the podium in Springfield, Massachusetts, and went through the list. Pop Herring, the coach who cut him, the franchises that drafted before Chicago, the players and executives who had underestimated him at various stages. He thanked them, literally thanked them, not sarcastically but honestly, for giving him what he needed. He said, "Thank you for the motivation." He wasn't gloating. He was explaining the engine. He was pulling back the curtain on the specific mechanism that had powered 40 years of refusal to accept other people's ceilings. Every slight, every passed-over pick, every evaluation that said good when it should have said historic. Every form of doubt, from the explicit racism of a hallway in Wilmington to the quiet structural racism of a corporate culture that couldn't imagine what it was looking at in the 1984 draft. All of it had gone into the same place, had been stored in the same file, had been converted into the same fuel. Think about that for a second. Think about what you carry. You have been in rooms where you weren't the first choice. You have sat with evaluations of yourself that were wrong. You have had people look at what you could become and see something smaller, something more manageable, something that fit more comfortably inside the assumptions they already carried. You know what it feels like to be the third pick. The question is what you do with it. Michael Jordan showed one answer, not the only answer, not an answer available to everyone in every context, but an answer that emerged from the specific conditions of his life. From Wilmington, from the segregated classroom, from Roots playing on a television screen, from Dolores Jordan telling her son that the past had happened, but now he had to figure out what to make of things going forward. He made something out of it that will outlast everyone who doubted him. If this story landed with you, if any part of it felt familiar, leave a comment below. Tell me about a moment when someone looked at you and saw less than what was there, and tell me what you built from it. Subscribe if you want to keep hearing the stories that go deeper than the highlights, the ones about what greatness actually costs and where it actually comes from, because the league that said it was too black to succeed became the most popular basketball league on earth, and the man they called a good player became the greatest who ever played. The story isn't finished, it never is, but the argument is won.